Alright, hello everybody. Today I have a review for you of a book called Krondor the Betrayal by Raymond E. Feist. This is the first book in the saga called the Riftwar Legacy. It is a 3-book saga, I believe. The other two are called Krondor the Assassins and Krondor Tear of the Gods. Now, these were written much later than a lot of stuff that happens in the world of Midkemia, which I've talked about the Serpent War Saga, or no, I haven't talked about the Serpent War Saga. I've talked about the Riftwar Saga, which is Feist's first 4 novels. After that, he went on to later sagas, but then what ended up happening is that I guess it was Dynamics. They wanted to create a game based on the world of Midkemia and using some of Raymond Feist's characters. And so there was a story written for a game called Betrayal at Krondor by Neil Halford and John Cutter. Now, what ended up happening is that Feist licensed, his world and characters to Dynamics, and they made the game Betrayal at Krondor. Fun game, by the way. A little dated at this point, but still actually pretty well made. And he basically Feist basically reserved the rights to novelize the contents of the game in some way later on. And so after Feist had written a bunch of other novels that happened much, much later in time, he went back and he wrote this book and then 2 more kind of in the same time frame. And so whereas usually there's like a generation jump between saga to saga to saga, this from Riftwar Saga to Riftwar Legacy, and then to the Krondor Sons, which is the next saga that he wrote, there's kind of like a half generation jump. And I think that's actually a good thing because it allows us to kind of see overlaps of characters that otherwise we would kind of, characters would have moved all the way to the background in time for the next saga, whereas here we have some characters that are moving forward and some characters that are moving back, and we get kind of a nice mixture of all of that, which I think is really nice. Now, this saga, this 3-book saga, is, I would say, not quite. It has its problems. I mean, by the end of this 3-book saga, it starts to feel very kind of like Dungeons and Dragons tabletop campaigny. There's a big world-ending thing that isn't built up in a very satisfying way. It's good, but it's kind of meh. It's I'm not going to say that any of these books are bad. That would be an overstatement. But what I will say is that if you're looking for the kind of epic fantasy, lots of intrigue and politics and not confusing but complex plots, that will kind of taper off by the end of this saga. And if you want more of that, you should go check some of the other books that ironically Feist wrote later. These ones kind of feel a little bit like an afterthought by the time you get to the end of the 3rd book. However, this particular book, Krondor the Betrayal, is actually really, really good. It is more adventures of Jimmy the Hand, more adventures of Locklear, and more adventures of Pug before he gets super powerful and becomes a little bit less interesting. There are, of course, saga-specific characters or book-specific characters like Owen Bellaforte, I believe. Belafonte? Something like that. Just Owen most of the time. Gorath is a Mordel chieftain, who is basically the whole reason why this story is taking place. We get a wizard who was Owen's teacher, or not teacher, but like he basically set Owen off on the path to learn a little bit of magic, named Patris, who's a fun character. Owen mainly develops in this book, and he is interesting and gradually and believably develops throughout the course of the story. Gorath has a major character shift that brings him into this book, and then another major character shift over the course of the book, which I think is very well done and very well motivated. Patris is kind of a not quite comic relief, but like a fun character in the sense that he adds a lot of color to the last third of the book. He doesn't do much in the first half or the first 2/3 of the book, but then later on he adds a lot of color to that last part where things are kind of getting grim, and he kind of provides a little bit of a change of pace from the grimness that they're facing. For this particular book, Owen and Gorath are kind of the star characters. Most of the story has them present and follows them as they kind of go along with all the other schemes that are happening and they're a part of, right? So, it starts out with Owen, Gorath, and Locklear headed south to Krondor. Then Owen, Gorath, and James are headed east to some other city. I'll get a little bit more into that in the spoiler section, but, Owen and Gorath are kind of the stars of the show, whereas Jimmy and Locklear and Arutha and so on and so forth are kind of there to provide a little extra color and a little bit of nostalgia bump as well. Plus, we get to see more development of Jimmy the Hand, who, again, in the Riftwar Saga, he kind of develops from thief to, upcoming squire. And then if you go from there to Krondor's Sons, he's kind of already in his later years at that point. And so it's like, he doesn't do as much. And so we get to see a lot more of his fun and kind of unique perspective on the world in this book, which I think is something that is definitely to its favor. So, let's see. Owen is kind of a failed magician character. He's the son of a minor noble. Patras found out that he's kind of good at a little bit of magic. Owen took a journey down to Stardock, and tried to learn there for a year. Didn't really have much success, and so now he's kind of lollygagging on the way back to his father's estate to kind of show up and be like, hey, I'm back. I kind of, it didn't go so well. Gorath, he is a Moradel chieftain with a warning for the kingdom. That's the start of the story. No spoilers there. Basically, and you'll learn this, if you read this book, it's in like the first chapter, right? The rumors of Mermandamus, the Moradel leader from the Riftwar Saga, uniting the Moradel again for attack on the kingdom. Basically, there's a leader who's built up power in the north who's saying Mermandamus is still alive and we have to go and save him, basically. What I'll say is that this particular book has a fairly complex plot with a lot going on and some good splits. We have points in the game, as I mentioned a little earlier, where it's Locklear, Owen, and Gorath, James, Owen, and Gorath. We have Owen and Gorath by themselves in some parts. We have a part where Pug is kind of by himself. We have Pug, Owen, and Gorath. And we even have minor roles for like Arutha and some other characters. We don't get to see much of Liam. We see a little bit of Martin, but not too much, but just enough to be good, and kind of stuff like that. This particular book has a fairly serious tone with the usual kind of occasional sprinkling of light comedic relief. I would say that there's nothing too tone-breaking in this book. Feist usually has a little bit of gallows humor here and there, and so you'll find that, as well as kind of humorous looks at the culture clash between Gorath and humanity kind of thing. Because this book is based on a video game, or because this story was made for the purposes of video, there's a lot of combat, and lots of combat magic, especially little combat magic, paralysis or blinding spells, stuff like that, which is a little bit out of step with the other books, but it still kind of works. It's decent, but at the same time, it's something that if you had read all of Feist's books and then you from before this era and after this era, right? And then you read this one, you're like, well, nobody is no one's casting, Harry Potter style point a wand at someone and a spell happens and hits them like a baseball, right? That's just not a thing in most of these books. But in this particular series, we get a lot more of that because there's a lot more kind of gameified elements, I guess you would call it. Let's see. There's lots of Feist, as I've said before, one of Feist's specialties is talking about and describing small unit combat. Kind of 5-on-5 kind of combat, all the way down to 1-on-1. He's good at doing all of that, very good at doing all that. He's decent at larger scale combat, but sometimes that larger scale combat feels like it's not entirely carefully thought out, on a map kind of thing. It's like, oh yeah, this happens. This kind of sort of it fits, but it's not super amazing, right? But his small unit combat is actually amazing, and we get a lot of it in this story, including some really good descriptions of 1-on-1 combat, where sometimes he gets a little bit cliched when he talks about 1-on-1 combat. There's always it's big sword versus rapier is a common thing that he has in his stories, right? And not like Guts' big sword, like, you know, a bastard sword, right? And so we get the first hint of a cliche of James ducking down and stabbing forward with the rapier with his left hand just touching the ground. We're going to get that a lot more in later books in the series. You know, because it happens once in this book doesn't make it a cliche. Because it happens 3 more times in 2 more books does make it start to become a cliche. So at this point it's new, but later on it happens over and over again, which is, you know, it's not bad. It's like 4 sentences out of the 3 books, right? But at the same time, it kind of colors your perspective on the single unit combat because you see the same thing happen multiple times without it being something that really like, ooh, this is cool. It's just like, whatever. It's how he finishes his combat. The plot in particular has a few good twists and one excellent twist, which I will not... We'll see how much I want to spoil in the spoiler section. I wrote down some notes of stuff I want to talk about, but I'm going to try to spoil a little bit, but not too much. We're trying to find a happy medium here. Because this book is based on a game, again, there's a lot of traveling that's just inherent to the story. They have to go from some city way up in the north, all the way down to Krondor, from Krondor all the way to Romney, from Romney all the way back to Krondor, from there all the way up to Sethenon. There's a lot of moving around, because there was a lot of moving around in the game, because that's kind of how games work. People go from place A to place B, and you as the player are said, oh, your goal is to get here and do this, and then you have to get here and do this. So there's a lot of moving around in this story. Now, on the good side, that means that we get to see a lot of the Mctemian Kingdom. We get to see a lot of the distinctions of local cultures, different people living in different places doing different things, and all that's really excellent stuff. Yet at the same time, it still definitely feels kind of like an intentional journey, right? Than a lot of other books where there is travel going on, but you're not necessarily along for the ride for a lot of it, stuff like that. And yet at the same time, despite the fact that this is a traveling story, there's still a lot of political intrigue, uncertain motivations. I think it's handled generally pretty well. All right, let's get into some spoilers. So, this story starts with Gorath. He's coming south to warn of a Mordel chieftain named Delicon, who is rallying the Mordel in the north and claiming that Mermandamus is alive and needs to be rescued from Sethenon. Locklear is up in the north, spending a year in the north because he had some kind of an indiscretion with someone else's wife in Krondor, and he got sent up there as punishment, basically. When the first chunk of the story is basically Locklear, Gorath, and Owen heading south toward Krondor, and there's a lot of there's a lot of small unit combat. There's a lot of small unit combat that gets skipped because, like, again, it's kind of mimicking the game. Basically, that part of the game, you're going south and you're just fighting group after group after group of people, and so they do end up skipping a lot of the fights for the purposes of what would you call it? For the purpose, and simply saying, oh yeah, now we have these extra wounds because of that fight, which speeds things up in a positive way while still showing that there's, I guess, like, consequences to the fighting. One of the cool things that happens is that they have to track down a Moradhel mage who is basically tracking them, funding the attacks on them as they travel south, and trying to also do some stuff with like illicit gem trading, basically, and some magical cool stuff. There's a good fight there. They fight him. I believe his name is Nago. I have to double check, but I'm pretty sure that's right. They fight him and a few different Moradel. Owen learns gradually how to cast how to cast spells for combat purposes. And they meet up with some good people. I think they talk with Earl Kasumi up in Lamut. And so we get to see a little bit of the Tsurani culture as well as there's some fun stuff where they get to a garrison and they say, hey, can you send 3 guys that look like us south along this road, and we'll head east and then south, and hopefully we'll evade stuff. There's a bunch of questioning of, like, are they being drawn in this direction, intentionally? There's They get into a gem smuggling ring and kind of break that up. There's a lot of cool stuff in that first chunk of the book. Eventually, they arrive at Krondor, and of course, Locklear's not supposed to be there, and so he's hoping that him being there will get him brought back from being banished to the north for a while. And so he stops up, they get there, and but like everybody in Krondor knows why Locklear was sent north. And so, like, when they get there, Locklear stops a page, and he says, quote, "Send word to the prince that I've returned with a message of the gravest consequence," end quote. To which the page replies, quote, "It'll be grave all right, your grave, if the prince doesn't agree, squire." So just some fun, a little bit of a tension breaker in a way, right? Because, like, in theory, if Arutha thinks that Gorath isn't credible, Locklear could be in real, actual trouble. But, of course, in the end, by this point, we've had enough. We get a lot of interactions where Gorath talks about how things are done in Mortal society and comparing that with humanity, stuff like that. And so by then we know that Gorath is probably going to be seen as credible. In fact, they have Pug and Pug's daughter, whose name I'm forgetting off the top of my head right now. They do some mind magic and learn that he's telling the truth. And so that's good. After that, Locklear does actually get sent back north again. But what ends up happening is that Owen, Gorath, and James head east toward, I think, Romney. And then there's some cool stuff. They visit some nobles. They visit some temples along the way. There's a guy named Ethan Graves, who's a former mocker, who went to the Temple of Ishap, I believe. And there's some story elements based on him and what he's doing, and some stuff that happened to him that is a little bit kind of interesting and shady. So I'll leave that at that. There was a part on page 73 that I wanted to just mention real quick. Yes. So just to give you an example of how Feist handles small unit combat, we have Owen, Gorath, and Locklear in the sewers under Krondor, and just a quick combat between them and two men who turn out to be false Nighthawks. So, and here I'm reading. They turned in the direction instructed by Lim and moved to the corner where he had told them to turn. A short way along the indicated route, Gorath said, "Someone ahead." Owen put his ring under his right arm, causing the light to diminish. "Two men," whispered Gorath, "wearing black." "Which is why I can't see them," said Locklear. "Who are they?" asked Owen. Locklear turned and knew his withering look was lost in the gloom, so he said, "Why don't you just go up and ask them?" "If they aren't the prince's men or those mockers, then they must be enemies," said Gorath, stepping forward quickly, his sword ready to deliver a killing blow. Locklear hesitated a moment, and by the time he started moving, the dark elf was upon the two men. The first turned just in time to see his own death arrive, for Gorath slashed him deeply across the chest and shoulder. The second man drew his sword and attempted to slash down on Gorath's head, but Locklear stepped in and parried the blow high, allowing Gorath to run him through. It was over in seconds. So that's just kind of like an example of how small unit combat goes in a Feist story. It's descriptive. It doesn't skip any of the action. There's actually coordination between different characters. And yet it doesn't get flowery or wordy. It's very effectively written. And that's not maybe that's not the best example, but as I was looking through this trying to figure out places, that was the one that jumped out at me first. So we'll go on from there. We get Gorath, James, and Owen heading east, and they meet up with Guy du Bas-Tira, page 97-98. Guy du Bas-Tira, Duke of Rhiannon, and first counselor to the King of Isles, waved them to a table where he sat down heavily. "Get me something to drink," he shouted. And a soldier, detailed to be his orderly, hurried to where an intimidated-looking barman waited. The man about hurt himself on the edge of the bar trying to bring out a tray of pewter jacks. He quickly filled them and ran with them to the Duke. He placed the first one before Bas-Tira and then served the others at the table. He said, "Would my lord care for something to eat?" "Later," said Guy, slowly removing his heavy gloves. "Something hot for me and my men. Cook up a side of beef." The innkeeper bowed and backed away, knocking over a chair at the next table, which he quickly righted. Guy looked at James and nodded. James' brow furrowed, but he returned the nod. Duke Guy said, "So, Arutha is sending you east to snoop around?" James said, "That's one way of putting it, your grace." He pointed to Gorath. "Now explain to me why I shouldn't cut his heart out and hang you for being a black-hearted rogue and traitor to the crown." Gorath's hand tightened slightly on the hilt of his sword, but he didn't move. Owen's face drained of color, but he saw James smile. "Because it would irritate Arutha?" Guy laughed. "You haven't lost any of that mouth, have you, Jimmy?" The young man said, "I probably never will. We've been through too much for you to seriously wonder about where my loyalties lie, so I judged you were taking out your bad temper on me because you couldn't take it out on Arutha. Why has he got you so peeved?" And so, and that scene goes on where Guy du Bastera is doing a lecture series along that part of the kingdom, and he has Jimmy in as a person to like clap, no matter how badly worded the thing that he says is or whatever. And so there's some stuff about there. We get this nice like tension breaking tension throughout the book, and so that things get graver as things go on, but at the same time you end up with little bits of humor here and there that helps to endear the characters to the reader, as well as show how they interact with each other and kind of what they think of each other. It's a good device for development, I think. One thing that this book removed is it removed a lot of the silly little side quests from the game. Go save a farmer's cows or whatever. A lot of the side quests that are more important do remain. We have James and company dealing with this group of Nighthawks. We have a major situation with the River Pullers Guild in Romney, where they're up against the Ironmongers Guild, and there's this whole like guild war brewing. We have 50 dead lancers poisoned in one of the inns as they move east, and then we have a guy named Lyle Riggers, who is like Jimmy, who looks uncannily similar to Jimmy. We have Owen's uncle, who is being threatened by Nighthawks, and a rather rakish character named Navon du Sandeau. We have their meeting with Abuk the Traitor and their discovery of these little spiders that have poison in a groove on them so that you can draw your blade against it to poison your blade. Here we have something a little weird. In the third book, Silverthorn, of the Riftwar Saga, Silverthorn was this thing that you could only find around around one lake up in the north, and yeah, it was poisonous, but it was totally, almost impossible to actually get, right? The whole book was about them trying to find some of that stuff. Here, we have these two spiders with the groove for poisoning your blade, and one of them has nightshade in it, but the other one has silverthorn, which is something from the game that's kind of like a member berry. It doesn't really make sense in the context of the greater storyline, right? Like, there's no reason why they would use something as rare as silverthorn for poisoning blades when a bunch of things that are equally effective and much, much easier to find are actually available. It rings a little hollow to me. Later on in the story, we get some good intrigue where Jimmy, Patris, and Locklear are messing with Delacon's army. They basically pretend to be renegade humans and go and they make a whole huge mess up there. But it's really smartly done in a couple of ways. There's a catapult trick that you really shouldn't miss, and I really don't want to actually spoil. And then there's this thing where they want to get some documents, but they also don't want to let everybody know that they're getting the documents. And this is really, really cleverly done and smartly handled, and it's one of the cool parts of the book that I really enjoyed. We have Gorath, as he kind of learns that humans aren't so bad. We have Gorath also learning that what he's been taught about Elvendar and the elves is not actually true. Is it Elvendar? I think it's Elvendar. And so we actually have Gorath making his way back. Yeah, it's Elvendar. Making his way back to Elvendar. Elves could be seen moving along the branches or at the base where fires burned as cooks labored, smiths worked metal, and other crafts were undertaken. It was the most beautiful place Owen had ever seen. He could hardly pull his eyes away until Caladan said, "Elvendar." Owen looked at Gorath and saw his companion sitting in rapt amazement. His eyes were wide and shining, moisture gathering in them. He said something softly, as if to himself, in a language Owen didn't understand. Owen looked at Caladan, who said, "How could we know?" "Gorath?" asked Owen. Gorath dismounted and said, "It's a legend. Barmalindar, the golden home of our race. Kaladin said, "We will take your horses. Walk to that tree with the white leaves, and others will meet you and guide you to our queen." Now they actually get to go meet the elf queen. Pug and Tomas are, of course, or Tomas is, I forget where Tomas is, but then we get this nice scene. We've heard about returnings in earlier books about the Moradel coming, a single Moradel kind of escaping the rest of his Moradel brethren and coming down to Elvendar and kind of becoming elves. We've heard of this before, and we even saw an example of it in one of the earlier stories. I think it was Magician Master. But here we see something a little bit more complex and interesting. She motioned. They meet with the Elf Queen. She motioned and said, "Our ranks lack only your presence, Gorath." He looked where she indicated and saw her advisors, a tall elf of many summers, next to whom stood one who was known to Gorath. Iranorn, the leader of the Glamordel, nodded. His expression was cold, but he held his place. "Gorath," he said. Another elf, one who looked as old as the first, said, "I am Asiala, of the Eldar, and am most pleased to see you here." Gorath was silent for a long time, and Owen was convinced some sort of communication was passing among the elves, silent but apparent to them. Then, in a strange gesture, Gorath pulled his sword from its scabbard. He moved toward the queen, and Owen was suddenly alarmed, but he noticed no discomfort on the part of the others. Gorath placed his sword at the queen's feet and knelt before her. Looking up, he said, "Lady, I have returned." And the actual result is that Aglarana, the elf queen, says, "No, you haven't quite returned yet. You still have one piece of business to do before you can return." And then they go on with the rest of the story. There is a part of this book where they go off, where basically Pug gets enticed to go off to another world to chase after his kidnapped daughter. And Owen and Gorath end up following him there. And we get this very video gamey kind of exploration of this island on this other world where there's no magic, but actually there is magic, and if you have a magic staff and you poke these little golden flowers with it, then you gather magic and you can use the magic in combat. It's very video gamey, and I can see that Feist was trying to maybe convert something that happens in the game into like a real story and was only partially successful. But yeah, it's not bad, but it's kind of fillery, and it seems to drag on quite a bit. And so with that, let's conclude the spoiler section. We'll go to the conclusions. I think I've left some things enough unsaid that if you want to read this book, you'll still find interesting things in there. Or if you've read it already, you've heard my opinion on some of the fun stuff. Anyway, off to the conclusion. This was the first Raymond Feist book that I read, and so it always will have a little place in my heart for being the first book that got me into reading this author's stuff. But it was good enough that I said, "Oh, I need to read more of this author's stuff," and so I continued to do so. Now, as for this saga, at least in my opinion, this is the best book in this 3-book saga. If you want more Jimmy the Hand, you will read this book. If you want even more Jimmy the Hand, you will read The Assassins. And if you like The Assassins, and you don't mind the kind of video gamey kind of feel that these stories have, you'll continue to read Tear of the Gods, and you'll enjoy Tear of the Gods, even though I think that the crisis in Tear of the Gods is not especially well motivated. I would say that this book in particular is worth reading on its own, just for some more Locklear and Jimmy. We have a lot of these time skips between sagas and Feist books, as I mentioned earlier, and this particular series gives us more time with characters that I liked. And so, if you found Jimmy the Hand annoying, maybe you'll want to skip this saga entirely. But if you found him fun and you liked his perspective on things, you'll want to read these books. As I mentioned earlier, it's nice to have a half-generation skip instead of a full-generation skip. And so, if you like the tone of... If you liked the Riftwar Saga, you might like this book. If you like video games, you might like... If you like, tabletop RPGs or computer role-playing games, you'll probably also like this book, even though you might kind of see some of the elements of game going into it, which is fair, But if you read this book and you like it, what I'll say is, for the rest of this saga, I would say proceed with caution. If you find this book kind of repetitive, then maybe you don't want to read the Assassins. But, you might check out the Assassins. And then if you still feel like you're doing good on Assassins, go on to Tear of the Gods. You won't regret reading Tear of the Gods, but it is, I think, a little bit more... It lacks the gravity that the earlier books have. Assassins, I haven't read it in a year or two, so I'm a little hazy on Assassins. But Assassins has some really good... one of the things that Feist is really good at writing is thievery, stealth, stuff like that. And so Assassins has a lot of really good Jimmy the Hand thievery and stealth kind of elements to it that are a lot of fun. Tear of the Gods is kind of just a fun adventure romp that has a... like I said before, right? The world-ending thing that happens in the Riftwar Saga is interesting, and it's good because it's built up appropriately, and it's not something that just happens every 10 years or 15 years or whatever. With Tear of the Gods, you have this thing where it's very lucky that the forces of evil decided to put all of their chips onto this one particular thing that happens over and over and over again, just when there was a bunch of people that were ready to prevent it, kind of thing. So it's just not as... It's just grasping for gravity that it hasn't earned, is the way I would put it. That doesn't make it a bad book. It just means that you might kind of, not be as engrossed in the story as much as the characters. Anyway, that's the conclusion of this review. Krondor the Betrayal is a fun book. It's a very good book by Raymond Feist. It is the start of the Riftwar Legacy saga, which is good, but a little bit less thoughtful, I guess, than some of the other sagas. So, this book in particular is worth reading. If you think that you've got enough of Jimmy the Hand after this, then you might move on to Krondor's Sons, because that's where we go to a generational shift, and we have new characters and new stuff, with the old characters very much in the background by comparison. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this review. Yeah, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I don't know where I'm going for videos the rest of the week quite yet, so we'll figure that out. But yeah, have a good rest of your week, and I will see you next time. Of course, there'll be links in the description where you can pick up a copy of this. And of course, if you want to support the channel, there's also links in the description for that too, as well as the usual stuff you can do on YouTube to help support the channel. Anything you do is greatly appreciated. And so yeah, have a good week, and I will see you next time.